Poetry Center, bringing poetry to Patterson since 1980 at Passaic County Community College.
I'm pleased to welcome you here to the Distinguished Poet Series at Passaic County Community College. We are going to make Mark Doty an honorary poet in residence here because I keep asking him to come back. And he's been so wonderful each time. I want to say before I begin that these readings are made possible by grants from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, Department of State, by the National Endowment for the Arts, and by the Governor's Invitational Tennis Tournament grants. They're also made possible by funding from Passaic County Community College, which has supported this program for the 26 years now, and by the donations of individual people who are Poetry Center members and donors. And none of the things we do, none of the contests or awards or any of the rest of it could be done without the funds provided by these organizations and by individuals. So we always want to thank them for that. Besides that, I'd like to tell you that the videos of our Poetry Works USA programs are being shown in Patterson, but they're also being shown in UA Columbia Cablevision, which is in northern and central Jersey, on Sunday afternoon at 4:30. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity and try to remember to watch the show. It's on every Sunday at 4:30. Now, today, we're really happy to have Mark Doty with us. We probably are a little behind, I think, on the number of books of poems that Mark Doty has. I know he has a couple of new books, but we've included in his bio The Source from HarperCollins, Sweet Machine, Atlantis, which received the Ambassador Book Award, the Binghamton Poetry Prize, and a Lambda Literary Award. My Alexandria, chosen by Philip Levine for the National Poetry Series, and also won the National Book Critics Circle Award, Britain's T.S. Eliot Prize, and was a National Book Award finalist. Bethlehem in Broad Daylight, and Turtle Swan, another book. He has published Heaven's Coast, a memoir, which won the Penn Martha Albrecht Award for First Nonfiction, and Firebrand, which came out from HarperCollins, an autobiography. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim, Ingram, Merrill, Rockefeller, and Whiting Foundations, and from the National Endowment for the Arts. He teaches in the graduate program in creative writing at the University of Houston and is a frequent guest at NYU, Columbia, and other programs. He lives in Houston, New York City, and Provincetown, Massachusetts. And I'll let him mention the names of his most recent books, and also I believe we have his recent book for sale outside if it hasn't already all been purchased. I also want to say that I think Mark Doty's poems are rooted in ordinary life, and yet they take wing in an incredible way through art, through music, through the references he makes in his poems. And I think his poetry is complex, original, eclectic, and exciting. Let's welcome Mark Doty.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks to Maria and her troupe here for good work on behalf of our art. And I think this is a great room in which to give a reading, in part because of this gentleman who sort of peers curiously or censoriously, it's hard to tell, over the edge behind my shoulder. I have history looking down on me. Well, I'm going to read you a mix of some brand new poems and some things from School of the Arts, which is a book that came out earlier this year. actually now last year. And what can I tell you about these new poems? Well, we'll just plunge in. I'm going to begin with a poem that began in Manhattan with the song is not exactly the right word, outcry of a street vendor in my neighborhood who has the most remarkably abrasive and powerful voice. And he sells a toy, which I have never actually purchased one, so I'm not really totally clear about what this toy is, but it appears to be a little piece of a felt or rubber fabric attached to a string. And when you've seen this, right? And when you pull this thing in exactly the right way, the little mouse races around and looks incredibly alive when you pull the string. So he can pull it back and forth over both hands, and the mouse runs inside the hole in his fist and races up his arm while he says over and over again its name. I have a feeling that if most of us bought this toy, we would have, a piece of lint on a string. But he manages to make it incredibly alive. Right? Now, it would help me to recite this poem had I been born in New York City. But I cannot claim that honor, so I have to kind of fake it, all right? The poem and the toy are called Magic Mouse. Scrap of fur or fabric scrambles hand to hairy wrist, flees into the hole, thumb and forefinger make in the fist, most warm days, 6th Avenue and 14th Street. Big-headed guy squats, hands outstretched, and the toy slips, knuckle to back of the other hand, scurries to the nest, as if of its own volition, while he blares over and over same flat vowels, somehow half the time trumping layered horn and air brake and din without apparent origin, raising his terms above the avenue, as if he peddled not the thing itself, but its unprintable name, Magic Mouse. His accomplishment, a phrase the alphabet refuses. Ma, as in nah, as in no way. Jick, the voice's arc fallen hard back to the sidewalk. Mouse, a bridge with a long slide in the center. It won't work unless you're loud. Seal your nasal passages. Inflect 5 syllables in blat and euphony. Then the little 3-syllable follow-through, price tag vocalese, tailing away like an afterthought. $1. Even halfway down the block, he's altered the air, made the spine around which some fraction of city arranges itself, his beautiful thing in diminishing coda as you're further away. Magic Mouse, $1. I practice, I can't get it right. Maybe what's required is resistance. Indifferent citizens impelled in 4 directions, scraps of cell phone recitations into private ethers, mechanical sobs his syllables cut through and against. Maybe it's the sheer persistence of the ugly span of phrase lifting up and over what it's built to represent. Or else the engine of his songs, the nothing that could contain that tumbling, scrappy model of a living thing in his hands. So he says it again and again, while the little toy, all the word won't hold, always escaping, goes on with its astonishing work. Well, so we have to applaud for our friend here, because imagine that somebody says to you, all right, you have to sign Magic Mouse. You know, he did it. Phenomenal. I read that poem for the first time in the city a few weeks ago. One of my students was at the reading, and then I ran into her again, and she said a few days later she was walking through Chelsea, And she heard this voice behind her down the street saying, "Magic Mouse." So now she's being haunted by... To be a poet is, I think, to live within a certain kind of paradox in that one devotes a great deal of one's energy to shaping these very precise and somewhat obsessive little artifacts, which, you know, the majority of the country that surrounds one absolutely could care less about, you know. And so, you know, there's this kind of odd dichotomy of having the thing that looms so large to you be somewhat culturally invisible. And, you know, like all poets, I worry about this. Like, what does it mean to devote oneself to something so out on the margins? And again, you know, in a bad mood about that. And I was in such a bad mood when I went to one of the favorite poem readings, which have been organized in the wake of Robert Pinsky's tenure as Poet Laureate of the US. And I'm sure lots of you know about those. They're great events. They're designed for just citizens to come together and recite poems they love or poems that matter to them. And I've been to several of these, and every time find myself sort of moved and startled all over again by what people do. So in my bad mood about poetry's fate, I went to such a reading. This is called Theory of Poetry. The old words don't perish, though it seems they do. We hurry to place our attention where no one has attended before, and desire propels everyone away from old texts falling into sleep and dust. Dust and sleep, pages burning so slowly you wouldn't even know there's a fire. Or that's what I think half the time. Then, at the bookstore, a young man reciting, slight for 14, blonde, without irony, but not self-important either, possessed of the words. All right, maybe they perish, but the old cadence inhabits him, his proud East Texas voice newly arrived in the landscape of things that end and things that persist. He makes the poem his own, even as he becomes a vessel for its resistance to being forgotten, its reluctance to disappear. The old words are dying. Everyone forgets them, though the boy has the look of someone repeating a crucial instruction that must be delivered, word for word, as he has heard it. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. What he actually said was, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, but I couldn't really get that into the poem. A number of these new poems take the form of theories of one thing or another, sort of attempts to formulate if not an understanding, at least a question about some aspect of experience. Rilke said famously that, you know, the poet's job is to live the questions, which is a great relief, because if you had to live the answer, you would be in terrific trouble, wouldn't you? So you just heard Theory of Poetry, and this is called Theory of the Soul. And it would be useful for you to know at the outset of the poem that the things listed initially are substances to which it is possible to be allergic. It's a very partial list. Theory of the soul. Penicillium, fusarium, mucor, 3 varieties of ragweed, marsh elder, ligustrum, pollen of white ash, black willow, aspergillus, mugwort, cocklebur, ryegrass, fescue, sweet vernal, timothy, cockroach, dust mite, dog, house dust and feathers, shrimp and tuna, milk and egg. The allergist assistant has pierced the skin of my back with 10 clusters of 10 needles, each dipped in tinctures, and we're waiting to see which ones make me sick. She says, "You're okay, right?" and leaves the room. I'm feeling a little tired, holding my face in my hands, then warm, leaning forward a bit in my chair. And the doctor says, "How long ago did you give him that shot?" A nurse says, 10 minutes. And I say, "I had a shot?" 10 minutes. No perception of the gap. Just a jump cut. A little queasy, and then the hot center of a buzzing host, afraid I'll sue them because they've injected me with solutions of mouse hair, lobster, and egg, and optimistically left me to my own devices. Adrenaline, the doctor says. You had an allergic reaction to the allergy test. I confess a failure to anticipate the self-evident. I thought when you blacked out, you'd see it as if from the outside. Sudden swoon like a movie, people gathering in a drama above your head. But of course, I wasn't there to know I was gone. Later, when I tell my friend, she says, "How can you know when you're not awake?" And I tell her, this is what troubles me. Where, during the 10 minutes, was my soul? Not that I think there's a winged homunculus or a tiny spiritual being secreted in the body, but nor do I believe animation and intelligence, the gathered emotional weight of half a century, can be considered mere meat or electric impulse, brought to nothing at the cessation of the pulse. Blake and Caravaggio, Whitman and Cezanne, nothing but enzymes? I've been around enough dying to know that last breath wings out something more than air. But then where was I, or it, or that, if the soul's embalmed by a mere injection of seafood and dust? Combustion, ferocious heat, the fountaining sonic architecture of Purcell, de Kooning's energy lattice, the endlessly inventive shifting chromatics of Ravel, switched off, sent to sleep? Maybe the soul's a kind of muscular fiber shot through the flesh, inseparable. Or the flowering toward which the energies of the plant are entirely turned, the amaryllis devouring itself and flinging its own body into radical shifts of form in order to arrive at scarlet, speaking the single term of its arrival. Or say the soul resides in an emulsion of oil and earths brushed across linen sized with boiled rabbit. In aria, or tercet, or counterpoint pushed up out of gut and pearwood or maple. The soul of the poem, if it has one, not on the page or screen or your skimming eye, but in the after of embodiedness, fleeting as breath, in this body and then that, given, passed on, or else gone. And that is why we love to kiss, because then we come closest to the exhaled quick. But where is my work when I'm prone on the allergist's floor? The doctor who recommends, once I am breathing regularly, that I avoid oysters, and encourages me to call him again. This is a completely weird experience, because you sort of go to an allergist with the notion that you would be assisted by this, and instead you sort of get stuck full of things, and you say, well, you're allergic. Okay, so this is another theory, and this is a poem that began when I was in an artist colony in upstate New York at Yaddo in Saratoga Springs, which is a wonderful historic place where writers and visual artists and composers come together and people just focus on their work. But because these people were all in one place, there are interesting kinds of collaborations. And I met a painter there who asked me if I would be part of a project he was doing. And his project simply involved asking people to sit down in front of a video camera and to clap for as long as they wanted to. That was it. This poem begins in that experience, and then it wants to think about the experience of visiting a remarkable building in progress. The building is a cathedral in Barcelona called the Sagrada Familia. Lots of you know about this place. It's by the great eccentric architect Antoni Gaudi. It wasn't finished in his lifetime. It probably won't be finished for another couple hundred years, if ever, because it's enormous and wildly eccentric, right? We are accustomed to buildings based on right angles and sort of geometric forms. And Gaudi liked the forms of seashells, flowers, spirals you would find in sunflowers, all kinds of natural shapes. And he built his great, organic, rather threatening looking edifice based on these forms. If you try to imagine a Gothic cathedral with hot wax poured over it, that's something like the effect. Okay. That's a lot of introduction. This is called Theory of the Sublime. "You will," said Carlos, "be in my project?" Carlos is a painter who no longer makes use of paint. His finished work will be a room of monitors, on each screen a different person clapping. I am simply to sit and clap my hands together while Carlos videotapes for as long as I like. Of course, beginning is a little awkward, self-conscious, even though the camera's set on a tripod and Carlos is hiding behind a large chair. I'm reaching for some sort of rhythm to perform, turning my attention away from the sunlight and the tall windows of the studio. But then what simply begins to take place, a minute into the voyage, is a rhythm, a pattern arising from the body, and the pulse becomes firmer, more persistent. Life of a tree unfurling, green burl spreading out its swath of selfhood and actuality. The clapping is a night crowd of leaves billowing out to obscure the quick chips of stars. The soul occupies the night town, reclining in the shadowy chairs. The soil looms darkly beneath. Soul spurts up out of there, charred, raising its green ribs up over a black field. All signaled, clapped out in the hurry of one hand sharp against another, rising further until it's alternately praise and defiance. Praise for the world and the inevitable fierce accusation any singularity is, any lifting individual arc. That's spiraling, like climbing the steep winding of the cathedral in Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia, stone steps built to the mathematics of a narrow seashell, my feet obscured in darkness, a built night. And then in a while, many whirls up, the terrifying small balconies perched at the back of spires of conch or chestnut burr or whatever spiked and tiled intensity the architect pronged from his melting fantasia, his program of severe transformation. his enforced, well, no one made me go up there, but once you start up, there is no backing out, passageways into the sublime, further, after the little resting platforms, to strange arched bridges flung between towering honeycombs, an unfurled vegetal perch behind a glazed cypress studded with thick white doves, up into pinnacles of smashed golden tile, wounds encrusted in glass, extrusions of fruit and stone gathering like wax at the lip of a candle. I'm mounting a vast beeswax taper, a honeycomb thing thrusting unlikely, perfectly solid and somehow entirely unstable. Far out there is the Mediterranean, tip of a crane, dogs barking, dog run down in the square, sharp green parrots like flying jewels tussling over scraps of rolls. And then, at the height of my clapping, when I can push no further into the thinning air, perched at a ridiculous and frail slip of masonry, holding together or apart two enameled narwhal tusks, aimed at the next, at the forwardness, at the limit of praise. When flesh begins to reassert that it is welded to the giddy soul trying to get out from the top of the head, body that's climbed all the way to the top of the concrete vertebra and now contemplates stepping off, but the prospect is too dreadful, so we take pictures instead. A few tourists snapping photographs as if to hold at bay the tremendous ambition of it. Then begins the winding down the towers again. Down swifter than up, lightheaded, body in darkness, flushed with the crazy excelsis of the tower, raked out of breath, a little sick with all that glory, stumbling a bit, hands stinging on the railing, coming to rest like a pigeon from a long, high flight, as if to land too swiftly would somehow injure the heart. So one must land carefully, making out of bare soil a little container by pressing one's own breast and belly into the earth. And when I come to a complete stop, the silence seems extraordinarily firm and authoritative. And Carlos rises up from behind the tall chair where he's been hiding to nod his head approvingly, to indicate that something has happened here. And in a while I ask how long I've been clapping, shaking out my stinging hands, and Carlos looks at his watch and says, 36 minutes. The room crackling with accusation or prayer to what thrills and defeats us, defiance and applause. That has that odd quality that new poem sometimes has, where you're not quite sure what you've done. I think that's something. What is that exactly? Yeah. Usually that means I will learn more about it as time goes on. Okay, I'm going to read you a few poems from this recent book, School of the Arts. And as that was a poem which involved climbing a long, long staircase. And one of the strange characteristics of the staircase in that cathedral is that it's planned so you can go up one way and you come down the other. So once you start, you can't stop. There are people behind you and you're climbing and climbing and there's no getting out of it. Feels like quite a metaphor. Well, this poem also involves a flight of stairs, but it's a very, very different one. And you will meet here my old dog, Arden, who was a Newfoundland and Retriever mix who made it to the age of 16, and he is one of this book's muses. An emblem of ragged persistence in time. This is called The Stairs. Back when Arden could still climb our stairs, sharply pitched, turning near the top, the sort old carpenters modeled on the stairways of ships. He'd follow Paul up to his study, shadow me up for socks or a clean shirt. Even if I went upstairs only for a minute, he'd wheeze and labor on the narrow steps and arrive out of breath, proud of himself, and collapse on the rug before coming down again. Up and down, all day. At night, he wanted to sleep in his bed at the foot of ours. Wanted it so badly, the pressure intensified the climb. What with the tall risers and his gimpy hind legs. So he cried and fussed and tried, gave up and went away, came back and tried again. If he couldn't make it on his own, I'd get up and help him, lifting his front paws and setting them into place, then my hands under his hips. The stairwell would smell of his anxiety, bodily, familiar, slightly acid. Once he could no longer climb something so awkward, it was as if he'd forgotten he ever wanted to. He'd wedge his muzzle into a hole he'd made in the sliding screen door, push it to the left, and sleep all night in the garden, on the gravel, beneath the spread of a Montauk daisy. Why can't I hold on to that image? The dreamer beneath black leaves and a spatter of summer stars. Indelible, that old man scent, the fear that makes the stairway steeper. One night, Arden went out to sleep in the garden, and I woke up about 3 in the morning in this terrible thunderstorm, crashing and booming lightning, and it was pouring down rain. And I went outside, and he was on the gravel, utterly sound asleep. Slept through this is a dog who was terrified of lightning, slept through the entire thing. And I thought, this is like old King Lear out on the moor. I'm going to throw a curve at you and read one you don't know. Okay? This guy, he had a little preparation in advance, but he's not prepared for this, so he's on his own. This is, but it's not a tough one. Okay? It's not so short. This is the sort of the counterbalance to that poem, which is so involving the fear of aging. Because this book is very much concerned with the problem of living in time. How do we handle the fact that we disappear ourselves, that what we love will disappear? Poets before me have been concerned with this question. And I assumed that as my life went on, I would acquire some sort of, wisdom or some kind of, tenable position in relationship. It just gets worse, is the truth. It just gets worse. But, you get more angry at time, which is primarily what this book is about. But I turned to a wonderful example of somebody who has lived gracefully in time. The poet Stanley Cunniness, his work many of you know. And Stanley is distinguished by not only being a remarkably old man, he's now 100, but having written his best poems later in life, having arrived at the highest degree of emotional vulnerability, kind of nakedness, spiritual availability, in his 70s and 80s. Yeah. How do you do that? One way he does it is by being a gardener. This is called Heaven for Stanley. For his birthday, I gave Stanley a hyacinth bean, an annual, so he wouldn't have to wait for the flowers. He said, "Mark, I have just the place for it," as if he'd spent 98 years anticipating the arrival of this particular vine. I thought poetry a brace against time, the hours held up for study in a voice's cool saline. But his allegiance is not to permanent forms. His gardens all furious change, budding and rot, and then the coming up again. I prefer any single part of the round. I don't know that he'd change a word of it. I think he could be forever pleased to participate in motion. Something opens. He writes it down. Heaven steadies and concentrates near the lavender. He's already there. I also have, this is another poem, I have the urge when I get to the quote, I want to perform it in Stanley's voice. Mark, I have just the place for it. But I always feel like I have to resist. Okay, we're at the 2-poem mark. It's always good to know that, so you can adjust your attention accordingly. We'll go back to that old dog. This is a poem set in out of the end of Cape Cod in wintertime. It's called Meditation, the Night of Time. Snow circling the steeples. One chilly boat in the bay's dull mirror. Cold morning after Christmas. And on the way home from town, old dog hobbling in the wet. Little bursts of steps, a rest. Another shorter burst, a rest. I'm contemplating a phrase quoted by candlelight at the meeting house. We live in the night of time. Oxen in the stable, the donkey, thick nostrils steaming, their clear-eyed taking in of the God in the hay. Same open, unmediated way they see everything, gaze unclouded by duration. What does Arden see through the scratched oil patches of his cataracts, limping home in the snow-turning rain, old hips, slow progress up the street from the harbor? Isn't the great power of animal eyes that we can't read them, and therefore something of the dayspring about them, all the unsayable a part of one continuous? My dear boy, walking further into the realm of the speechless. Night of time, daylight of the unmeasured. Then it isn't the darkness that's infinite, is it? Imagine the sort of sky flung over this town Christmas Eve, just before nightfall, all of 4:30 these days, when the world shuts down early for lack of customers. Baroque evening, wild clarity out over the harbor, but to the south, a lowering mood above a street shining greenly in stormlight. And in between those two poles, bracing alcohol flame blue and that deepest sable, stretches a shifting, flickered, most of it, a warm plum, brandy, had it been a flavor, a heated flush spreading. Maybe that's the sort of night time is, rippling even as you look. And if the whole thing races toward darkness, first there's this. If that's the night of time, Mark, what's so bad about that? And I'll end with a poem which refers to the medical process of ultrasound, you know, that means of imaging the interior of the body. And in this case, it's a veterinary ultrasound. And if you've ever seen this done, you know, the ultrasounder has a kind of thing that looks like a wand or a pen that moves across the body, sending in sound waves. And it results in images appearing on a screen, which to me look like, I think, Jackson Pollock kind of vague, a rather watery abstraction, a much weaker version of Jackson, watercolor Jackson Pollock, right, in black and white, inscrutable, completely unreadable images at which the doctor looks and makes decisions. Okay? So this poem opens with an attempt to describe those images on the screen. It's called Ultrasound. Blackboard covered with a dust of living chalk. Live chaos cloud, wormed by turbulence. The rod glides, and the vet narrates shadows I can't quite force into shape. His kidneys might. The spleen appears. I can't see what he sees, and so resort to simile. Cloud bank, galaxy blurred with slow comings and goings, that far away. The doctor makes appreciative noises to encourage me. He praises Beau's stillness. I stroke the slope beneath those open, abstracted eyes, patient, willing to endure whatever we deem necessary, while the vet runs along the shaved blonde, blue-veined, gleaming with gelled alcohol to allow sound to penetrate more precisely, a kind of wand, pointing a stream of waves nothing we could hear, to translate the dark inside his ribs onto this midnight screen. The magic pen slides. The unseen's made, well, far from plain. No charitable harmony. Less anatomy than a storm of pinpoints, subtler than stars. Where does a bark upspool from the quick, a baritone swell past the sounding chambers? You can't see that, or the clock built into the wellspring, or that fixed place from which a long regarding of us rises. It wasn't cancer, wasn't clear. We didn't see really anything. He's having trouble keeping up his weight. His old appetites flag, though on the damp morning trails, he's the same golden hurry. Today I'm herding the two old dogs into the back of the car after the early walk, wet woods. Beau's generous attention must be brought into focus, gaze pointed to the tailgate so he'll be ready to leap. And Arden, arthritic in his hind legs, needs me to lift first his forepaws and then, placing my hands under his haunches, hoist the moist black bulk of him into the wagon. And he growls a little before he turns to face me, glad to have been lifted. And as I go to praise them, as I like to do, the words that come from my mouth, from nowhere, are time's children, as though that were the dearest thing a person could say. Why did I call them by that name? They race this quick parabola faster than we do, as though it were a run in the best of woods, run in their dreams, paws twitching, even asleep they're hurrying. Doesn't the world go fast enough? We're caught in this morning's last of April rain, the three of us bound and fired by duration, rhythm too swift for even them to hear, though perhaps we catch a little of that rush and ardor, furious poetry, the sound time makes, seeing us through. Very much. Very nice. Thank you. Now the curtain has fallen, the house lights have come up, the curtain has risen again, and we find ourselves in a different kind of rhetorical space, and you are now free to break the spell in which I have placed you, and if I'm lucky, and ask questions, anything you'd like to talk about work or the poet's work in general. I'd be happy to try to address. Yes?
Can Any new dogs in your life?
New dogs? Not yet. Characteristically, I wrote a book about my old dogs, which is not of poems, but a prose book, which is coming out next year. It's called Dog Years, and it's basically about dogs of the inner life. Like, why do our relationships with animals matter so much to so many of us, and what is it about these wordless companions that calls forth such allegiance in human beings. So that's on the way. And now, having written that book, I actually do feel ready to get a new dog. It's fine now. And it's just a matter of getting things like arrangements and schedules into place so that we'll be home enough. And that's coming. Just gotta get it just right. Yes.
Do you ever write prose and then turn it into poetry on the same subject, or can you go from feeling one thing toward another?
There are incidents that show up in both forms, and when that happens, they have a very different kind of weight. I mean, I think of a poem as being an extremely intense spotlight of a feeling, basically, and of idea. So that, say, that little poem like The Stairs, about Arden's inability to climb the stairs, I hope is, even though it's quite brief, is saturated with feeling an idea about mortality and time and the speaker's own concern with his aging and so forth, compressed into a tight space. That same incident probably appears in this new prose book, or in a different version. And there, it's part of a bigger architecture about the life of this creature and my relationship to him, so that that particular moment carries a different kind of weight. And that's really interesting to me, that you can take the material of a life, the givens of experience, and you can turn them in different ways. Sometimes when I've done that, I'll find that the emotional value or coloration really shifts. So an incident that seems quite say positive in prose may become darker and loaded differently in a poem, and vice versa. And so I like that you could look at the same thing in different contexts.
Is that a chicken and egg question? Because I would reverse it and say, does one lead to the other? That is, have you written prose and then decided that you could make that into a poem, or vice versa?
Well, it depends on if I feel done with a particular piece of material. Have I investigated that far enough? And sometimes, all our lives are full of stories, moments, images that matter to us, and they don't necessarily mean just one way. Okay, so think about an object that you loved when you were in first grade. Okay, an object that mattered to you. And if you were going to write today about your relationship to that object, you might describe that in one fashion. But if I ask you next week to write again about that object, you might see it in a little different light based upon the mood you're in at that moment. You could turn the same thing differently. So this is why memory never fails us as writers, because in fact, it's never still. It's not stable. We change it and revise it. A friend of mine, a therapist, uses the image of progress through a life as being like climbing up one of those spiral staircases inside a lighthouse. So she says, you're always going around the same core, the past, what happened, but you're always standing in a different position in relationship to it, so it looks a little different, and it means a little differently as you move through your life. This is why as writers continue to return to their childhoods, they find often it doesn't wear out, but you just simply see it in a new light. It's probably why, I believe it's the actor Dirk Bogarde who wrote something like 6 memoirs of his childhood, in each of which, his parents seem like completely different people. Because that's what it's like, to move through time and keep looking at them differently. Yes?
I have 2-part questions.
Mm-hmm.
First, I didn't read your prose, but probably I believe that it is also full of imagery and metaphors, like your poetry, right?
Yes.
And the second question, what do you think, or what your definition of prose poetry?
Well, this is an interesting moment in terms of genre because there's a lot of hybrid work going on that's really intriguing. Essays that are behaving like poems, and memoirs that are like my friend Nick Flynn's marvelous book, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, which is a memoir that acts like a big long poem. And sort of breaks into lyrical passages, and there's a little play, all kinds of interesting things happen. Anne Carson's work is notable for its marvelous genre bending. And so this is a very rich moment for that. I personally don't write prose poems because they make me nervous. I like lines, and I like the way that the line breaks up a sentence and gives to the reader just this much language at a time. Pause, and here's a little more. Pause, and here's a little more. And I'm very interested in the way lines shape our experience of sentences. And so I don't want to let go of the power of the line, except, of course, when I'm writing prose, when it's trying to do a different thing. And so that I don't want to be like in the middle of that one. I either want lines or not.
But what is the prose poem? How it was defined?
Well, I define it as something I don't do. But many people do it very, very well. And I think what it is a kind of poetic thinking and a poetic use of language that wants a more relaxed formal framework so that it doesn't have the pressure of line making upon it. In other words, that would suggest it's a little less interested in sound and a little less interested in silence. Yes?
To go back to the image of the lighthouse with the core, do you read poems from Turtle Swan now? And how do you feel about those early poems now?
Right.
What are they for you?
Oh, there's this magazine called McSweeney's. You know that kind of interesting magazine, right? And they're doing this special poetry issue where they pick poets, and you pick one of your poems and they pick one of your poems. And the poem of mine they picked is a poem from my first book, Turtle Swan, which came out in 1987. I wrote this poem more than 20 years ago. And I read it and I think, well, the language isn't really very interesting. The verbs are kind of dull in this poem. And it has a kind of plain-spoken gravity that I think is attractive, but it seems to me there are missed opportunities in it. And I'm mentioning this because I thought, well, they picked this poem, there must be something interesting about it. So I read it at a reading after not having read it in a long time, and I thought, why? This subject is on my mind too because in about 2 years I will be publishing a new and selected poems. And so that process of trying to winnow your own work and actually make judgments about what you would choose to keep from the person you were then. And to try to do that with respect for the past and the person who did his best writing those poems out of the world in which he lived, and with a sense that in shaping such a collection, you're kind of telling the story of your life, or the story of your work. You're making decisions about what matters and what to put into the foreground and what to let go of. And I find that a fascinating thing to think about, that it's a little bit like assembling a photo album that you're going to give to people. And in assembling such an album, you say, well, we're going to move through college very quickly, or we're going to linger here, on this trip to Singapore. I mean, it's very much a process of moving other people through your life, and it's very odd. I know that's not a very intelligent thing to say about it, but that's my experience of it at the moment. It's just, isn't this strange? We'll never forget a couple of years ago running into Galway Connell in the city, and we chatted for a while, and he said, oh, I got to get going because I'm working on repairing some old poems. And I wanted to say, you leave those alone. I love your old poems. Don't you dare. Like, you have to have a certain, you have to at least to some degree, honor the person that you were, because you can't go back and rewrite what you did 20 years ago without making a whole new thing. And that doesn't mean you couldn't go back and fiddle with a word, or improve a line, but the idea of really recasting a poem completely seems to me wrong-headed. We change too much for that. Yeah.
Revising. How
Yes.
long does it take you to revise? Do you show your
Right. Most of my poems will come tumbling out intensely and messily at the beginning. And so there'll be a big sprawl, and then there will be shaping and moving and working with it I do. And I can usually feel when I've arrived at the point when it would be worth showing it to somebody else. And that's when I know enough what the poem is about, and I have a sense of its architecture, and it's not mortally embarrassing. Okay. Then there's a process of learning that goes on, which has to do with gradually getting more distance from the poem. So I'll show poems to my partner. I will, and that starts to change things a little bit. I will sometimes show them to a poet friend, although I'm more likely to do that with whole book manuscripts now than individual poems. A way that I learn a huge amount about poems is by reading them to audiences. So I always like to read some new work. And the poem, a couple of these, the Theory of the Soul and the Theory of the Sublime, are quite new, and they've been read a couple of times and revised accordingly. But I feel like I'm still listening for how much of this do I need? Can I pare this back? Are there weak spots in there? Yeah. So, and that, I think that's really useful to us, because even though you read your own work aloud at your desk, and you really need to do that to start hearing it, it's not the same as reading it when there are a lot of people listening to you, because part of you inevitably listens with them, and you start to get a cooler view of the poem. Yes?
We were talking earlier about cricket and the sound of cricket, and you can't define it. And I was recalling Stanley Cunniness, who was talking about the little engine, desire, desire, desire. And I run a poetry group, and everyone laughs because the poems they call me boohoo Biro, because they're always sad. So if I was going to say a word about me, it would be absence. Do you have a cricket that at this point in your life would be, desire is the perpetual Stanley.
Right.
What would be absence? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I see what you're saying. Well, I wish I didn't, because it would be great to feel more various. But I really, I said a minute ago people change too much. But in fact, I mean, one of the characteristics of one of the odd things about going back and reading that early work is, of course, it's about exactly the same thing that I'm writing about now. And you always feel, if you're paying attention and pushing yourself, that you're doing something you've never done before. And then, of course, you discover we've been talking about this and concerned about it my whole life, because our core concerns stay with us. And I would say I'm very much a poet and a person who worries about evanescence, and the way that things come into their fullness or their clarity for us just as they're disappearing or passing. And so, does that mean that you kiss the joy as it flies, or does that mean that you take on the work of being an elegist who mourns for the world, or both? Right. And that's just like, I just can't escape. That's what I write about again and again and again. Yeah.
When you finish writing the poem, and when you stand before this audience here, is there a way of you thinking that you have to deliver this, or do you have to perform this poem? Where does the performance come into? You're presenting it to us, it's personal at some point, and then you present it to the world.
Right. Well, it gives me pleasure to give poems to people. I like that. I mean, the work of making poems is intensely solitary, and even if you write in a coffee shop or a classroom, wherever you work, you're by yourself while you're working. And very alone with the decisions that you make, and with the kind of personal investment you place in the poem. And so bringing it into community feels like a really lovely thing to me. And part of what's lovely about that is watching people rise to meet it. So if the poem is emotionally expressive, or it touches upon a problem that we share as human beings, which means any problem, I suppose, then you see that in people's faces, and that's wonderful, because it makes you feel much less alone, and it makes you feel like that poetry does a work in the world of making connection. You know, it points to our common bonds, our common ground. So I really like that. Most of the connections, of course, happen when the poet is not around. The work goes out in the world, and it's on the web, it's in the book, it's memorized, it's in the classroom, it's wherever it is, and people are out there having their experience of it, which I just find miraculous. And I mostly don't really get to know very much about that. So the reading is a way that you do get to know about it. I have work that is much more, some poems are much more amenable to performance than others. There are things that are more complicated, or they're quieter, and then there are poems that are more that are funny, for instance, which changes things in a reading, or perhaps more immediately available to the ear. So there's a shift in there. I want to be a poet who can be heard and read, and I have friends who are primarily performance people whose poems on the page are just a shell or an artifact, and you really need the voice and the music and the action, the whole thing, to have the experience. And then I have other friends who are pretty much page poets, and you could hear them read and it wouldn't really make very much difference to you. In other words, you'd be just as well off with having the poem by yourself. So there's this whole gradation of the ways that people think about it. I don't think there's any right way. Yeah.
How come you write poems?
Wow. How come I write poems? Out of the mouths. It feels like if I didn't write poems, I would not know what I feel and what I think about things. It's the only way I have to be more present and aware of my life and how it feels to be me. Does that make sense? Sometimes I think that we, or at least I, go about my daily life, and I can just be on the surface of things and just doing this and doing that, and not really remembering. Say, what were you doing 2 hours ago? Yeah? What did you notice when you went to the grocery store yesterday? We can easily just kind of be in a little bit of a haze. And poetry says, wake up and pay attention to this moment and everything about this moment that's around you. Listen to how you're feeling. Listen to what you're thinking about now, what's troubling you or exciting you, or what you're wondering about, and give voice to that. So that's why. Also, I don't think I can stop. Too much of a habit now. Yes?
I'm curious about vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, your reference to Ozymandias, I think, is has a limited audience.
Mm-hmm.
But do you, in terms of education, do you think that there are some forms of education that predispose someone to knowing the value of the effects of words and the variety of wording that is there? Can the same vocabulary be used in a less poetical situation effectively? What is the interchange of vocabulary, and how does one go about sorting it out?
Well, I believe in using the necessary language to say what I mean. And in that particular instance, because the speaker in the poem is, in theory of poetry, is worried about poetry disappearing, what the monuments of art that decay or that last. And so it feels to me like somehow exactly right that the poem the young man recites is Ozymandias, a poem about a great ruin, that's decaying, but somehow still there at the same time. And of course, there are plenty of readers or potential audience members who won't know that reference to the Shelley poem. And I just have to hope that if you're interested enough in a poem, or some other poem of mine has earned your attention, you go find out what that is. the great house of poetry has many, many, many doors. And one of those doors is the language that we use every day, conversational talk, the language of the street. And another one of those doors is a far more refined kind of literary or more erudite language. And so in this house we have on one end we have James Merrill's beautifully decorated and elegant suites, and on another side we have a poet like Etheridge Knight's, a really rough, tumultuous language of the jail cell and of the street. It's the same house, and one can lead you to the other. So I have found often that students who find a poet who speaks to them, a poet that can matter to you, will then say, oh, well I've discovered I can like a poem. I can care about it. I'll try that one. And maybe I don't understand this, but let me work with it a little bit. So I have real faith in the ability of readers to rise to the occasion if they get the chance to see why that might be a pleasurable thing to do. And so what happens sometimes, I think that the worst kind of education for readers of poetry is the kind that says, I, the teacher, possess the secret meaning of these words, and you, the students, must find the symbols, okay, or guess at the meaning that already exists. And the truth of poetry is that the meaning does not already exist. The meaning is what we make. Either you make it by yourself as a reader, or this morning in the group we're reading those poems together and we're making the meaning. That's what meaning is. It's what we construct together. It's not out there somewhere in the universe. So I want to encourage teachers to work with students in that way. Let's read this interesting thing together and let's see what meaning we can find or construct together and build for today. And I think if you do that, what you find out is that people really enjoy it. It's intrinsically pleasurable to read good poems together and talk about it and figure it out. It's fun. Yeah.
If you were to make a comment to education, what would you suggest would enrich the potential poetical use of language in, let's say, the elementary school? For instance, if you can read some of the editorials of the English newspaper, and their choice of vocabulary is quite different from the vocabulary that you have here. It tends to be more poetical, richer, has more of that land use type of reference. I'm a retired school teacher, and I do know that the kids didn't know any poetry at all, unless you told them something that was salacious.
Well, you bring poetry to them, and there's a great, enormous range of contemporary poetry out there. Such variety that there's poetry for everybody. There is something that will speak to any reader if you can do the work of finding out what it is, if you can help to make the connection. So I think that I just came back recently from the California Association of Teachers of English, where we were talking about, what can teachers in, South Central LA do to promote poetry in the classroom. And it was just great to hear these people talking about bringing, everything you can think of, bringing hip-hop lyrics, bringing Lucille Clifton's poems, bringing Yusef Komunyakaa, bringing, you name it, into the class and say, look at this, look at this, look at this. And you don't have to like any of this, but let's see if there's something here that you do like or that you do find exciting. And I really think that works.
I enjoy your poetry.
Thank you. One more question, yes?
Yes, I finished Zadie Smith's novel, in the last chapter, the little poem.
I am so proud of that, yes.
I said, now why didn't you tell me what the whole poem is? What is the poem?
This is Zadie Smith's beautiful novel On Beauty. And one of the chapter, or the section epigraphs is a quotation from School of the Arts, which is just delightful.
School of the Arts.
Yeah, it's for this recent book.
I mean, it was just a work, it just caught my attention about somebody asking, like, what good is time? And then the person replies,
yes.
How else are we going to grow souls?
Yes.
How else are we going to grow our personality?
Let's see. So that's, when I say I hate time, Paul says, how else could we find depth of character or grow souls? Right. Yeah. Well, Paul gets all the credit for that. Okay. Yes?
Can I just ask one question? I think that poetry, especially a lot of your poetry, cries out for an experiment. And the experiment would be,
Yes, sir.
if you returned to 14th Street and 6th Avenue and just took a 1-minute film of that person doing his thing, then you reran that with a voice overview of your poem, it expands 1,000 times.
It'd be fun.
And I think a lot of poetry can be developed with the visual and the poet part of it, the verbal. It's tremendous when it's viewed that way.
Sure. The one thing you want to remember about that is that one of poetry's great secrets is that you don't need any equipment, right? You just got these words. And the great thing about these words is, you know, it can be published and sold, but it cannot really be owned. It's very easy for anybody to copy this or simply pick up a page and memorize it and come into possession of it and give it away. It is, in that way, sort of fundamentally resistant to consumer culture and kind of appealingly subversive. And anything that you attach to it, which means, you know, like in order to experience this poem, you need the film, or you need the photograph, or you need the recording, or whatever, sort of dilutes that a little bit. So there's a little bit of poetry, sort of like, well, pure uselessness, basically. That is a great virtue. And that's a good place to stop. Thank you for coming. That's really a big part of my life is traveling for readings and for guest teaching and so on. And some of that is sort of just routine work, but then there are experiences that stand out and become the triggers for poems. So one of the poems I read today involved, in part, traveling to Barcelona and visiting a particularly amazing cathedral under construction. And so that poem wouldn't have happened in that way had it not been for that trip, you know, that provided a metaphor, a structure that I could use to talk about what I was already thinking about anyway. The thing about writing about travel is that you never really write about this strange new place that you visit. You're really writing about home. You're writing about the things that you always think about. It's just that it gives you a different way to see it, you know, or another lens to look through to help you focus your experience.
I noticed today and other times that you've read time and space, age,
yes,
growing gracefully older,
we'll see,
wiser. Where is that coming from? Have you spoken about that when you were younger, and now that one is a little older, you speak about it now?
Well, it's just different. I think I have always been concerned with the brevity of experience, with the evanescence of things and passing things. And there's certainly a way in which the brevity of life makes something that much more beautiful, makes it seem that much more precious to us. And so that's always been a concern of my work. But things have shifted in a more personal way in that I'm 52, so of course I'm thinking about middle age and what it means to be middle aged. And I also lived in New York City in September 11th, 2001, and that introduces a feeling of contingency and of it kind of raises the level of threat at which we all live, and so the fragility of the body and the ways in which the body can fail us are subjects which press upon my attention. Absolutely.
Where were you at, if you don't mind me asking, when that dreadful day?
Oh, I was in Manhattan. I was it was actually the second day of a fellowship I had at the New York Public Library. So I got up that morning all eager to go to my new office at the library on 42nd and 5th Avenue. And I walked from my apartment, which is on West 16th Street, to 6th Avenue to get on the train. And there were a lot of people standing around on the corner looking up. And I looked up too to see what they were staring at. And we were all looking at that smoking hole in the top of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And I said, what happened? What happened? And somebody said, oh, well, a little plane flew into it during the night. You know, it's just sort of dismissed the importance of it. And I thought, well, okay. And it was just the second day of my fellowship, so I thought, well, I better get myself to the library. And by the time I got there, really all hell had broken loose. People understood that a jetliner had hit the North Tower. It was burning. And then shortly after I arrived, the second tower was struck. We in the library were watching the BBC News on a computer screen. So it was very odd that we, even though we were in New York City, we were also watching a mediated version of events. Then shortly thereafter, you know, as we understood that the city was under attack, the library closed and we left the building and people were streaming out of Midtown. The subways were already shut down by then. And so with, you know, tens of thousands of other people, I was walking away, walking back downtown towards home. And I was just at the, on 34th Street and right in front of Macy's when I saw the second tower fall, North Tower fall. And that was an extraordinary moment, something that you just didn't think, you know, could be possible. Surrounded by people who all sort of gasped or put their hands to their chest and just stopped to watch that. What amazed me, well, several things amazed me. One was the orderly way that everybody walked out of Midtown. That there was no pushing or shoving or trampling or running. People were just simply going to, in a civil way, leave and try to take care of each other, be respectful of each other. And the way that we were surrounded by sound. People had brought televisions to the front of storefronts. They'd pulled cars over and turned their radios on. There were people trying to get the news on cell phones and repeating it out loud. So everywhere you walked, this event was being narrated. I don't know what I imagined. That I never imagined the apocalypse as having a narration and that everybody would be reporting. So it was as if we were both refugees and we were at the same time people listening to the news all around us. It's a very weird experience.
Speeding up again, back to the same question. How much has that played in your thinking about time and space?
Sure. Well,
and have we learned anything from that, or are we back to normal?
Oh, well, complicated questions, aren't they? And it's so soon. You know, you and I are speaking in March of 2006. Mm-hmm. It's not very long ago, and I think that the lessons and changes are very much in progress and will continue to shift and look different over time. One thing we learned is that things which seem solid, skyscrapers, American invulnerability, are not so. I think we've also learned, sadly, that our fear and our sense of woundedness, you know, as a country and as a city, can be transformed into occasions for war, for profit, and for you know, the wielding of power that seemed to have very little to do with those events. It was as if September 11th happened, and that became a trigger for all kinds of things which ultimately don't seem necessarily related. Several years of war, increasing repression of human rights in this country and elsewhere, a scary sense of the erosion of civil protections, legal protections, and of a kind of acceptance of things that feel like police state. You know, that we're used to saying, oh, well, whatever is necessary for our protection must be, in fact, necessary, must be okay. And that's just so easy for that to be misused. So that's very alarming. As an artist, I think, you know, I'm part of a community of people who are all feeling their way still towards a response. And I've written some poems which address the issue directly, although they're quite partial and quite personal. They don't attempt to be a kind of global response. or comprehensive response is perhaps a better way to say it. I've written a prose book in which 9/11 is very much the background, even though it has, it's not the foreground of the story, a book called Dog Years. It's coming out next year. And I think it's going to continue to, in one way or another, inform and resonate in the background of everything that I do for some years to come, because that kind of rupture in the fabric of things, that kind of outbreak of instability, is something that I can't forget, and I don't quite know yet how to understand.
And in closing, how do you look at your work? You know, when you travel the world, does your work reflect your experiences in your travels? I mean,
but my work sort of reflects everything that happens to me, feeds in there somehow or other. It may not appear directly, but the combination of experience and emotion and the flux of perception all become part of the poem. How I look at it myself, you know, I feel like I'm the last person who can see it in a way. I can see what I'm working on now, and I'm occupied with the questions of how to make those poems better, how to shape them, how to make them feel most alive to readers and hold something of the complexity of thinking and feeling that I would wish for them to hold. But when I try to stand back from my work and say, what is it? What does it do? How has it changed? It's really hard for me to do that, because it's a little bit like, you know, trying to study your own face in the mirror and having any sort of objectivity about what it is you're seeing. I think for all of us, when we look in mirrors, we see a combination of what we fear and what we wish, and the ways in which, you know, our understanding of ourselves distorts our vision. And that's doubtless true in looking at your own work as well. I figure you just have to make the things and do the best that you can. And we will perhaps leave it a good thing about time, that the future can sort it out and make judgments about what matters.